The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Thompson's front porch as he slowly rocked in his favorite chair. At 93 years old, his movements were careful but purposeful. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, gently held a steaming cup of black coffee, the same way he had enjoyed it since his days in the service back in World War II. Every morning for the past 47 years, Harold followed the same routine in his modest home on Pine Street. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., a habit he never lost from his military days. His house wasn't fancy, just a simple two-bedroom structure with fading white paint and dark green shutters. But it was his piece of heaven, earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. The garden was Harold's pride and joy. Even with his aging joints, he spent hours tending to his vegetables and flowers. The tomatoes were his specialty. The neighborhood kids said they were the sweetest they'd ever tasted. His rose bushes, planted in memory of his late wife Martha, bloomed beautifully each spring, filling the air with their delicate fragrance. After his morning garden check, Harold would put on his navy blue veteran's cap, adjust it carefully in the mirror, and begin his daily walk to Jenny's diner. It wasn't a long journey, just 3 blocks, but he enjoyed every step. Along the way, he would wave to Mrs. Peterson watering her lawn, pat the Johnson's golden retriever Max, and exchange morning greetings with the mailman, Tom. The walk to Jenny's was more than just a breakfast routine. It was Harold's connection to the community he had called home since returning from the war. The diner's bell would chime as he pushed open the glass door, and Jenny herself, a kind woman in her 50s, would call out, "The usual, Mr. Thompson?" She always had his spot ready, the third booth from the door, where he could see both the street and the kitchen. His breakfast was simple but perfect: 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, 3 strips of bacon, and endless refills of coffee. Jenny's teenage waitress, Sarah, knew to keep his cup full without asking. She reminded Harold of his granddaughter who lived out in California, always sharing stories about her school day while she worked. The other regular customers at Jenny's treated Harold with a mix of respect and fondness. They knew bits and pieces of his story. The young engineer who joined the Army Air Corps, served in the Pacific, and came home to help rebuild the town's manufacturing plant. Some mornings, the younger veterans would sit with him, sharing experiences across generations, finding common ground despite the decades that separated their service. After breakfast, Harold would take the long way home, passing by the town's Veterans Memorial Park. He often stopped to rest on the wooden bench facing the memorial wall, his fingers tracing the familiar names of old friends who never made it back. In these quiet moments, he would remember their faces, their laughter, and the promises they had made to live full lives if they survived. Back home by mid-morning, Harold would spend time in his small garage, tinkering with his collection of old radios and mechanical parts. The garage walls were lined with tools, each hanging in its designated spot, a testament to his engineer's mind that craved order and precision. The workbench held photographs from his younger days, Harold in his uniform, standing proud beside various aircraft he had helped maintain during the war. Life was peaceful, predictable, and just the way Harold liked it. The neighborhood kids would sometimes stop by for candy he kept in a glass jar by the door, and he would tell them stories about the old days, carefully chosen tales that highlighted courage and kindness rather than the horrors of war. His days had a comfortable rhythm, marked by small pleasures and quiet dignity. But Harold didn't know that his carefully structured world was about to change. The abandoned lot next to his property, which had stood empty for years, was about to become the center of a storm that would challenge everything about his quiet life. The piece he had built for himself, brick by brick over decades, was about to face its biggest tests since the war. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Harold was trimming his rose bushes when the sound of roaring engines shattered the peace. 5 motorcycles pulled into the empty lot next door, their chrome pipes gleaming in the sunlight. The riders were young men dressed in black leather jackets with patches Harold couldn't quite make out. At first, he tried to ignore them. Maybe they were just passing through, he thought. But an hour turned into 2, and more bikes kept arriving. The empty lot, which had been nothing but grass and wildflowers for years, was suddenly filled with motorcycles, loud music, and the sound of bottles clinking. That evening, as Harold sat in his living room trying to watch his favorite Western show, the noise from outside made it impossible to hear the TV. He adjusted his hearing aid, but it only made the rumbling of engines and bursts of laughter more uncomfortable. Around midnight, when the bikers finally left, They revved their engines extra loud, as if making a statement. The next morning, Harold discovered tire tracks cutting across the corner of his lawn. His carefully maintained grass, which he had nurtured for years, now had ugly brown streaks where motorcycle tires had torn through it. Even worse, empty cans and food wrappers had blown into his garden, settling among his precious vegetables. With the patience that comes from years of life experience, Harold decided to talk to them. He waited until the following weekend when the bikers returned. Wearing his veteran's cap and walking with his cane for support, he approached the group. The youngest ones barely glanced his way, continuing their loud conversations. "Excuse me," Harold said, his voice firm despite his age. "I'm your neighbor, and I was hoping we could talk about the noise level and maybe keeping the bikes off my lawn." A tall biker with a thick beard turned to face him. Well, what do we have here?" "Grandpa's got complaints." His words caused several others to laugh. The man, who seemed to be their leader, walked closer to Harold. "Listen, old-timer, this lot ain't your property. We checked. We can do whatever we want here." Harold stood his ground. "I understand that, but good neighbors show respect for each other. During the war, we—" "Oh man, here we go with the war stories." Another biker interrupted, rolling his eyes. "Look, Pops, nobody wants to hear about what happened a million years ago. Times have changed. Maybe you should get some earplugs and mind your own business." The disrespect stung Harold more than he wanted to admit. In all his years, even during the worst days of the war, he had never encountered such blatant discourtesy. He noticed some of the older bikers looking uncomfortable, but none spoke up. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. The motorcycle club made the lot their regular meeting place. They would gather 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes staying until 2 in the morning. Harold's complaints to the local police didn't help much. The lot was private property, and as long as the bikers had permission from the owner, there wasn't much that could be done about the noise. The final straw came when Harold found his garden trampled one morning. Someone had driven their motorcycle right through his vegetable patch, destroying months of careful work. The tomato plants were crushed, and his beloved rose bushes were broken and scattered. As he stood there looking at the destruction, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since his war days, a combination of anger and determination. That evening, sitting in his garage among his tools and memories, Harold realized that traditional approaches weren't working. These young men didn't respond to politeness or respect the way his generation did. They only seemed to respect power and machinery. As he looked at an old photograph of himself next to his military motorcycle, a plan began to form in his mind. Harold Thompson might be 93 years old, but he was far from defeated. He had faced bigger challenges in his life, and he knew that sometimes the best way to fight wasn't with fists or angry words. Sometimes, the best weapon was something completely unexpected. What the motorcycle club didn't know about Harold Thompson would have surprised them. While they saw just another old man with a cane, they were looking at one of the most skilled mechanical engineers of his generation. As Harold sat in his garage that evening, surrounded by his old tools and photographs, memories of his past came flooding back. Long before his military service, Harold had graduated top of his class in mechanical engineering from State University. His professors had called him a natural genius with engines, someone who could hear a motor running and diagnose its problems just by the sound. During the Depression, he had kept his entire neighborhood's cars running when nobody could afford new parts, creating solutions from whatever materials he could find. When World War II broke out, the Army Air Corps hadn't just wanted Harold as a regular soldier. They specifically requested him for their aircraft maintenance division. He remembered those desperate days in the Pacific, keeping planes flying with makeshift repairs under enemy fire. His commanding officer used to say, "Thompson can fix anything with wings, wheels, or an engine." Harold stood up from his workbench and walked to an old trunk in the corner of his garage. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, not from age but from excitement. Inside, wrapped in an old army blanket, lay his collection of technical journals and engineering notebooks from the war. He pulled out one particular notebook, its pages yellow with age but filled with detailed drawings and modifications he had designed for military motorcycles. During the war, Harold had modified the Army's motorcycles to perform better in rough terrain. His designs had helped save lives, allowing messages to get through when radio communications were down. The other mechanics had nicknamed him the Wizard because of his ability to improve any vehicle he touched. As he flipped through the old notebook, Harold's mind started working like it used to. His fingers, though wrinkled and spotted with age, traced the diagrams he had drawn decades ago. Despite what the young bikers thought, his mind was as sharp as ever when it came to engines and mechanics. The only difference was that now he had something they didn't: years of experience and knowledge that couldn't be found in any modern manual. Walking to the back of his garage, Harold pulled a dusty tarp off a large shape. Underneath was an old workbench he hadn't used in years. The surface was still organized with precision tools, micrometers, calipers, and specialized wrenches he had collected over his lifetime. Each tool had a story, and each had helped him solve complex mechanical problems that others couldn't figure out. Harold picked up a worn leather wallet from the workbench drawer. Inside were his old certifications and licenses, including one that would surprise the bikers. He had been one of the first certified motorcycle mechanics in the state after the war. He had worked on some of the most famous bikes of his era, including rare models that collectors now paid fortunes to own. Sitting back in his chair, Harold began making notes in a new notebook. His handwriting was slower than it used to be, but his ideas flowed as freely as ever. He wrote down calculations and sketch designs, planning something that would show those young bikers that age was just a number when it came to engineering excellence. That night, for the first time in years, Harold stayed up late, working on his plans. The sound of motorcycles from next door didn't bother him anymore. Instead, each rev of an engine gave him new ideas. He might be old, but his mind was filling with designs and improvements that would make even the most modern bikes seem ordinary. As he finally went to bed, Harold smiled to himself. The bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they were about to learn that appearances could be deceiving. In his day, Harold Thompson hadn't just worked on motorcycles, he had revolutionized them. And now, at 93 years old, he was about to do it again. The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. He had a plan, and more importantly, he had the knowledge and skills to make it work. It was time to show those young bikers that sometimes the greatest power comes not from strength or noise, but from wisdom and experience gained over a lifetime. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Harold woke up at his usual time, made his coffee, and went to check on his garden. But when he stepped outside, he stopped dead in his tracks. His heart felt like it had been squeezed in a vice. The garden, what was left of it, looked like a war zone. Motorcycle tracks cut deep paths through his vegetable beds. His tomato plants, which he had nurtured from tiny seedlings, lay crushed and broken. But what hurt most was the sight of Martha's rose bushes. Someone had deliberately driven through them, snapping the main stems and scattering red petals across the torn earth. Harold's hands trembled as he knelt beside the destroyed roses. These bushes were more than just plants. They were his last living connection to Martha. She had planted them 40 years ago, and he had tenderly cared for them every day since she passed. Now they were broken, just like his heart. For the first time in years, tears rolled down Harold's weathered cheeks. He picked up a broken rose, its petals still wet with morning dew, and remembered how Martha used to cut fresh flowers every Sunday for their kitchen table. The sound of loud laughter from the lot next door made him look up. 3 young bikers were standing by their motorcycles, pointing at his garden and laughing. One of them, the same one who had mocked his war stories, called out, "Hey, Grandpa, looks like your garden could use some landscaping." Their laughter echoed across the yard, each sound hitting Harold like a physical blow. But something strange happened at that moment. Instead of feeling defeated, Harold felt a familiar sensation rising in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced during the war when faced with impossible challenges. It was a combination of determination, anger, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that he would not back down. Harold slowly stood up, his joints protesting the movement. He walked back into his house, past the living room with its old photographs, past the kitchen where Martha used to bake cookies for the neighborhood kids, and straight to his bedroom. From the top shelf of his closet, he pulled down an old metal box. Inside the box was his life savings. He had been keeping this money for emergencies, though he wasn't sure what kind of emergency a 93-year-old man might face. But now he knew exactly what to do with it. The bikers had unknowingly given him a purpose he hadn't felt in years. That afternoon, instead of taking his usual nap, Harold sat at his kitchen table with a stack of motorcycle magazines and his old engineering notebooks. He made phone calls to old friends in the motorcycle business, some of whom he hadn't spoken to in decades. Many were surprised to hear from him, but none refused to help when they heard his story. He called his bank and arranged to withdraw a significant portion of his savings. When the bank manager expressed concern about such a large withdrawal from a senior citizen's account, Harold explained his plan. The manager, who had known Harold for 30 years, listened in amazement and then personally approved the transaction. As evening approached, Harold walked to his garage and began clearing space. He moved old boxes, organized his tools, and prepared his workbench. His hands might shake when holding his coffee cup, but they became steady as steel when he picked up his old wrenches and screwdrivers. The noise from the biker's lot continued as usual, but it didn't bother Harold anymore. Each rev of their engines, each burst of laughter, only strengthened his resolve. They thought they were dealing with a weak old man who would eventually give up and move away. They had no idea that their actions had awakened something in him, the spirit of a young engineer who had once helped win a war. As darkness fell, Harold made one final phone call. When he hung up, a small smile played across his face. Tomorrow, he would set his plan in motion. The bikers were about to learn that they had seriously underestimated Harold Thompson, and he was going to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, a flatbed truck pulled up in front of Harold's house. On it was something covered with an old canvas tarp, its shape suggesting the outline of a motorcycle. The driver, an old friend named Bill who owned a vintage motorcycle shop 2 towns over, helped Harold guide the truck into his garage. When they pulled off the tarp, Harold's eyes lit up. There it was, a 1942 Indian Scout, the same model he had ridden during the war. The motorcycle was in rough shape, with rust covering most of its surface and parts missing, but Harold saw past all that. He saw potential, just like he had seen in the broken-down planes he'd fixed during the war. "You sure about this, Harold?" Bill asked, looking concerned. "This bike needs a lot of work. Maybe we should find you something in better condition." Harold shook his head, running his hand along the motorcycle's dusty seat. "This is the one, Bill. She's got good bones. Besides," he smiled, "I've fixed worse things under enemy fire." Over the next few weeks, Harold's garage became his command center. He worked methodically, starting early each morning and often continuing until late at night. His old tools, which hadn't been used in years, came back to life in his skilled hands. The sound of metal being worked and engines being tuned became a constant backdrop to the neighborhood's daily life. The bikers noticed the activity in Harold's garage. Some of them would slow down as they passed, trying to peek inside, but Harold kept the main door closed. Only the sounds of his work and occasional glimpses through the side windows gave any hint of what was happening inside. Harold's restoration wasn't just about making the old bike look good, he was improving it. Using his engineering knowledge, he made modifications that would have been impossible in the 1940s. He installed hidden modern components while keeping the classic look. Every bolt, every wire, every piece of chrome was carefully chosen and perfectly placed. The work wasn't easy for his aged body. His fingers would often cramp, and his back would ache after bending over the engine for hours. But Harold didn't mind the pain. Each discomfort reminded him of his purpose, especially when he heard the biker's lab machines roaring next door. Jenny from the diner noticed he wasn't coming in for breakfast as regularly. She started sending Sarah, the young waitress, to deliver his meals to the garage. Sarah would often stay for a few minutes, fascinated by Harold's work. She started telling her friends at school about the cool old guy who was building something amazing in his garage. Word spread through the small town. Other World War II veterans began stopping by, sharing stories and helping when they could. Even some of the town's younger mechanics visited, curious about the traditional techniques Harold used. The garage became a gathering place for people who appreciated both history and engineering. One evening, as Harold was putting the finishing touches on the bike, he heard familiar voices outside. The motorcycle club had gathered in the lot again, their bikes roaring and music blasting. But this time, Harold smiled. He knew something they didn't. His work was almost complete. He stepped back and looked at his creation. The Indian Scout gleamed under the garage lights, its restored chrome and paint reflecting like mirrors. But its beauty wasn't just skin deep. Hidden beneath the classic exterior were modifications that would surprise anyone who knew motorcycles. The engine had been completely rebuilt with custom parts that Harold had designed himself. Tomorrow would be the day. Harold had timed it perfectly. The bikers always had their biggest gathering on Saturday mornings, As he closed up the garage for the night, he patted the motorcycle's seat. "We'll show them what real engineering looks like," he whispered. "We'll show them what experience and knowledge can do." That night, Harold slept better than he had in weeks. In his dreams, he was young again, riding across Europe on his military Indian Scout. But this time, the dream wasn't about the past. It was about tomorrow, and the looks that would appear on those young bikers' faces when they saw what a 93-year-old veteran could really do. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, clear skies and cool air, ideal for what Harold had planned. He could hear the bikers starting to gather in the lot next door, their motorcycles rumbling as they arrived one by one. By 10 o'clock, the lot was full of chrome and leather, just as he had expected. Harold took his time getting ready. He put on his old leather riding jacket, which still fit after all these years, though a bit more snugly than before. From another box, he pulled out his original Army Air Corps riding gloves, carefully preserved since the war. Finally, he placed his veteran's cap on his head, adjusting it in the mirror just so. In the garage, he made one final check of his restored Indian Scout. Every piece of chrome sparkled, and the deep burgundy paint seemed to glow in the morning light. He had worked extra hours polishing every surface until it shined like a mirror. But the real magic wasn't in how it looked. It was in what lay beneath that beautiful exterior. The sound of laughter and revving engines next door grew louder. Harold heard the familiar voice of the biker who had mocked him, showing off his new motorcycle to the others. It was perfect timing. With steady hands, Harold pressed the starter button on his Indian Scout. The engine came to life with a sound that made every head in the lot turn. It wasn't the harsh roar of modern bikes. This was different. The engine purred with a deep, smooth rumble that spoke of power and precision. Harold smiled as he heard the conversations next door stop mid-sentence. Slowly, he rolled the motorcycle out of his garage. The morning sun hit the chrome and paint, making it look like it was glowing. Harold took his time, knowing that every eye in the lot was now fixed on him and his machine. The bikers stood frozen, their mouths open in surprise. As Harold guided his motorcycle toward the lot, the crowd of bikers parted like a sea. Even their leader, the one who had laughed at him weeks ago, stepped back in amazement. The Indian Scout came to a perfect stop in the center of their gathering, its engine's gentle rumble filling the silence. Is that a 1942 Indian Scout?" One of the older bikers asked, his voice filled with awe. "I've only seen these in museums." Harold nodded, then began explaining the modifications he had made. He showed them the custom engine parts he had designed, the improved suspension system, and the special features that made this bike unique. As he spoke, the bikers gathered closer, their earlier mockery forgotten in their fascination with his creation. "The original engine was good," Harold explained, his voice strong and clear, "but I redesigned the valve system to increase power while reducing vibration. See this custom intake manifold? I designed it based on aircraft principles I learned during the war." The bikers listened intently, asking technical questions that Harold answered with ease. Their respect grew as they realized this wasn't just an old bike. It was a masterpiece of engineering that combined classic design with innovations they had never seen before. Would you mind starting it up again, sir?" asked the leader, the same one who had mocked Harold's war stories. His tone was completely different now, respectful, almost reverent. Harold obliged, and the engine's unique sound filled the air again. He explained how he had modified the exhaust system to create that particular tone, using principles of sound engineering he had learned decades ago. The bikers nodded in appreciation, understanding that they were witnessing something special. "Mr. Thompson," the leader said, using Harold's name for the first time, "we had no idea. This is incredible. Would you consider showing us how you did some of these modifications?" More bikers chimed in, asking questions about the engine design, the custom parts, and Harold's experience. The morning sun rose higher in the sky as Harold shared his knowledge, surrounded by young men who now hung on his every word. The same people who had dismissed him weeks ago were now treating him like a respected teacher. In that moment, Harold knew his plan had worked better than he had hoped. He hadn't just earned their respect, he had bridged a gap between generations using the universal language of engines and engineering. The days following Harold's motorcycle reveal brought changes nobody could have predicted. The empty lot that had once been filled with loud music and careless behavior now became something entirely different, a place of learning and respect. Every weekend, bikes would still arrive, but now the riders came to learn from Harold. It started with simple things. The biker leader, whose name was Mike, asked Harold to look at his motorcycle's engine, which had been making strange noises. Harold listened carefully, then smiled. "Your timing chain needs adjusting," he said, and proceeded to show Mike exactly how to fix it. Word spread quickly through the motorcycle community about the old veteran who could diagnose engine problems just by listening. More surprising was what Harold learned about the bikers themselves. Many of them, like Mike, were veterans too, from Iraq and Afghanistan. They had formed their motorcycle club as a way to deal with their own war experiences. When they discovered Harold had faced similar challenges after World War II, the conversations became deeper and more meaningful. One quiet afternoon, as Harold was showing a young biker named Jimmy how to rebuild a carburetor, Jimmy opened up about his struggles with PTSD. "Sometimes the memories just won't let go," Jimmy said, his hands shaking slightly as he worked on the engine. Harold understood completely. He shared how working with engines had helped him cope after the war, giving his mind something to focus on besides the memories. The garden that had once been destroyed became a gathering spot for storytelling. Harold set up chairs under the shade of his old maple tree, and on warm afternoons, veterans from different eras would sit together, sharing experiences and finding common ground. The younger bikers helped Harold replant his vegetable garden, and to his surprise, several of them showed real interest in learning about gardening. Martha's rose bushes were specially replanted by the entire motorcycle club. Mike had gone to 3 different nurseries to find the exact same variety, and the club members worked carefully to ensure each bush was planted properly. They even installed a small plaque that read "Martha's Roses," in memory of a great love story. The noise level in the lot changed too. The bikers still worked on their motorcycles, but now they were more considerate. They created a schedule that respected Harold's rest times, and they made sure to keep the music at a reasonable volume. Some of the older residents were amazed to see the same bikers who had caused so much trouble now helping elderly neighbors with yard work and home repairs. Harold's garage became a classroom of sorts. He set up a proper workbench where he could teach basic motorcycle maintenance and engineering principles. The bikers were surprised to learn that many of their modern bikes used principles that Harold had worked with during the war. His old engineering notebooks became prized references, filled with designs and solutions that weren't in any modern manual. The local high school heard about Harold's teaching, and soon he was invited to give talks about engineering and history. Students were fascinated by how he connected his wartime experience with modern technology. Several students even started coming to the lot after school, eager to learn from both Harold and the bikers. One Saturday morning, Harold came out to find his driveway had been completely repaved. The bikers had noticed it needed repair and had taken care of it while he was visiting his daughter. When he tried to thank them, Mike just shrugged and said, "That's what family does, sir." The transformation wasn't just in the bikers' behavior. Harold had changed too. He stood straighter, smiled more often, and had more energy than he had in years. Having a purpose and being able to share his knowledge had given him a new lease on life. His daughter noticed the change during her monthly visits, amazed to find her father surrounded by young people who treated him with genuine respect and affection. The local newspaper ran a story about Harold and the motorcycle club, calling it the Unlikely Brotherhood. The photo showed Harold on his restored Indian Scout, surrounded by younger veterans on their modern bikes, all of them smiling like family. The caption read, "Age is no barrier when wisdom meets respect." 1 year after Harold's motorcycle revelation, the empty lot next to his house looked completely different. The bikers had transformed it into a proper meeting place, with a small workshop they built themselves. They named it the Wizard's Workshop in honor of Harold's old wartime nickname. A sign hung over the entrance, showing a motorcycle and an airplane engine crossed together. The workshop became famous in the motorcycle community. Every weekend, veterans from different generations would gather there. Some came to learn about engines, others came to share stories, and many came just to be part of something special. Harold's restored Indian Scout held a place of honor near the entrance, its chrome still gleaming like new. What made Harold most proud wasn't the workshop or even his motorcycle. It was the mentorship program the club had started. They called it Wheels of Wisdom, and it paired older veterans with younger ones. Together, they would work on motorcycle projects, using mechanical work as a way to deal with their wartime experiences. The sound of engines and tools mixed with conversation and laughter became a kind of therapy that no doctor could prescribe. Harold's daughter Jane couldn't believe the change in her father. At 94, he was more active and happier than he'd been in years. She watched as he taught young veterans the secrets of engine timing, his hands steady as ever when working with tools. The respect these tough-looking bikers showed him brought tears to her eyes. The garden flourished too, but in a new way. The vegetable patch had been expanded, and now several of the younger veterans helped tend it. They had learned from Harold that working with the earth could be as healing as working with engines. Martha's roses bloomed more beautifully than ever, carefully tended by bikers who had come to understand the importance of preserving memories. Mike, the former biker leader who had once mocked Harold, underwent the biggest transformation. He became Harold's closest student, learning not just about motorcycles but about life. Mr. Thompson taught me that strength isn't about making noise or causing trouble, he told a local reporter. Real strength is about wisdom and using your knowledge to help others. The local police, who had once received constant complaints about the lot, now stopped by for coffee and conversation. Officer Sarah, who had dealt with many of the noise complaints, admitted she had never seen such a positive change in a neighborhood. The same bikers who had caused problems were now organizing charity rides and helping at the local veterans hospital. On Harold's 94th birthday, the club organized a surprise party. Hundreds of people showed up, veterans, neighbors, students, and bikers from all over the state. The highlight was when they presented Harold with a leather jacket custom-made for him. On the back was an image of his Indian scout along with the words "Original Wizard, established 1942. But Harold's greatest gift wasn't the jacket or the party. It was seeing young veterans finding peace through the same things that had helped him after his war, working with their hands, sharing their experiences, and being part of a community that understood them. The nightmares that had haunted many of them began to fade as they focused on rebuilding engines and rebuilding their lives. As Harold sat in his favorite chair that evening, watching the sunset over his garden, he reflected on how things had changed. The bikers who had once been his tormentors were now his family. His knowledge, which he had feared would die with him, was being passed on to a new generation, and his beloved Martha's roses were surrounded by new flowers, planted by young hands who understood the importance of remembering. The sound of motorcycles still filled the air most days, but now it was a sound of healing and hope. Harold had shown that sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger or force, but with wisdom, patience, and the willingness to share what you know. His legacy wouldn't just be the machines he had fixed or the gardens he had grown. It would be the lives he had helped repair, one lesson at a time. In the end, a 93-year-old veteran hadn't just solved his problem with the bikers. He had created something that would continue helping others long after he was gone. And that, Harold knew, was the greatest victory of all.